talk,
identity,
and access
management.
Welcome to the Identity Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
I'm good. How about yourself?
Good. It's been an interesting couple of weeks. I got a negative COVID test last week.
That's a positive.
Is a good thing, right? Yeah. Negative is a positive. And
Yep.
Right now I have fish swimming in my backyard. So I'm on the indirect path of Hurricane Sally. We got a lot of the rain without the wind. And I live on what you would call either a large pond or a small lake. Anyway, it's kind of breached into my backyard and it's right up against my house. And I've got about 7 inches of water in my backyard. So small fish, they're just enjoying my backyard right now.
So we might have to turn this into a breaking news podcast, right? If the floodwaters start to rise up and take over in the Georgia area where you're based.
Yeah. We might be on the Weather Channel.
Well, we will hope that we don't have a whole lot of flopping fish around in your backyard. Otherwise, maybe those can be put to use somehow, if that's something that you're into. Before we get into our main topic today, I want to give a shout out and make sure that this kind of gets out there. Jim and I did a special podcast for Ping's Identify 2020 virtual conference that's happening in October. So you're good to see our ugly faces as part of that virtual conference. So for folks who are interested in watching that and see kind of just how we go about creating a show live kind of on the spot, hopefully people will go out and register for that. I'll have a link in the show notes for people to get to that. So just want to throw that out there. And for today, we actually got a couple things, and we're going to talk through this project that I discovered and was forwarded to me by our guest. It's the Open Measure Initiative, and he's also performing some research into identity and access management, performance management. And I want to welcome to the show David Doret. He's the IT risk and cybersecurity representative from BNP Paribas. Based out of, is it Switzerland? David, is that where you're from?
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
Thanks for joining us. And you founded the Open Measure Project too. So we're definitely going to get into the research that you've been conducting, as well as that project itself, which I think is really fascinating. But before that, we have to go into the traditional first question for all of our guests. How did you get into the identity and access management space? Is it something that chose you, or did you choose it?
So I would rather say that IAM chose me, because when I started IAM, I didn't even know I was doing IAM. That was back in the early 1990s. I'm old. And I was doing IAM on novel network directory services. I was doing system engineering work, and I didn't even know about IAM or what the IAM acronym would mean.
That's definitely a long background. That's for sure.
Yeah, that's great. One of the things, David, you shared the research that you're working on, and I started diving into it. I mean, I thought it was interesting what you're doing, and then when I started reading the research, you take an academic approach to IAM and performance measures specifically. But one of the things I found so interesting was kind of the history of IAM. And I want to throw this out there because I'm sure most people weren't aware of how far the industry goes back, or maybe it wasn't an industry, but at least the initial coining of the term access management went all the way back to the 1960s, where folks were starting to share computers and share computer time, and the concept kind of came about that people may intentionally go about trying to access other people's work, and so you had to have access controls over the data so that people could only 1967, I'm thinking it's punch cards, right? You couldn't use punch cards to get to somebody else's data.
Yeah, exactly. And that's fascinating, because we are in IT and we feel that IT is something modern. And in fact, we have half a century of history and research in the field that is just right there. Absolutely.
So cool. So Tell us a little bit about the Open Measure project. I mean, that's how we found out about you. It's a big contribution to the IAM practitioner. Tell us how you started it, why you started it, et cetera, and what the Open Measure project is all about.
Yeah, so that started, I think, 2 years ago. We were exchanging with a bunch of friends and peers, IAM practitioners. We were giving a series of talks in Germany on IAM at the time, and we were a bit frustrated by the fact that IAM products and service vendors and analysts, they do a great job at doing market research, but there is quite a bit of marketing propaganda in the lot. And we wanted to have a neutral platform for IAM professionals to exchange knowledge, exchange experiences, and so on and so forth. And so since I'm a big fan of wikis, then I built Open Measure. And the idea is to have a cool, open-minded wiki where all IAM professionals could come, get the knowledge, get the information for free, and if possible, for a few of them at least, make some contribution.
So if someone wants to contribute to the Open Measure project, and we'll have a link to it in the show notes, it's open-measure.atlassian.net. But if someone wants to contribute to that, do they just go to the website and register for an account? What's the best way for someone to become involved with that initiative?
So the wiki is public. I immediately hand over credentials to everyone. They just can subscribe online, and then I hand over a full subscription to them. Because this is a non-profit association, we have this legal statutes that makes it completely free, so I can hand over as many members as I can without incurring any license costs, which is great. And I'm very thankful to those who give us these cloud services for free. Then all those who wants to contribute, then they can just reach out to me on the platform, and I just change their profile, make it an editor profile, and then they can create pages, edit pages directly on the wiki. They just reach out to me, and I'll be most happy to hand you over the modified permissions on the wiki. I don't do it initially from the very beginning, because since we have now a little bit more than 600 people on the platform, I thought that it was just normal to not to do a vetting on those who would contribute, but just to ensure that those who will contribute are IAM professionals, and not anyone from the internet, which would not be. This would be the jungle.
Yeah, no kidding, right? We see what happens with Wikipedia, for example, right, where people make edits that maybe they probably shouldn't. So yeah, there is definitely some access control that needs to be in place for access control best practices, which I totally agree with. Well, that's pretty cool. It's a great website. There's a lot of good information there, a lot of things like best practices and different ways to measure IAM programs and other types of information. So hopefully people will go out there and check it out and volunteer to help contribute to the knowledge base that everyone can learn from. With that, I think that's great, and I think that leads us right into the research that you've been working on around IAM performance measurement. So we can set a level set for the folks who are listening. What did you study as part of this research, and can you talk a little about who provided the data?
Yeah, sure. So when you start an academic research project, usually you want to find a subject that has some that is a little bit original, that brings something to the table. And so I was doing this as part of a master thesis, and I of course wanted to do the master thesis on my main area of expertise, that is IAM. And looking for a subject, I observed that most of the academic work was around technology. We have plenty of research on technology, protocols, standards, and so on and so forth. But we don't have a lot of research on the IAM as an organization, as a function within the organization. And yet we all know as IAM professionals that this is the key, the people and the processes. And yet this is not very much researched. I would even say that it is not researched at all. So I thought that one way to start this field of research or subfield of research would be to take it from the perspective of how do organizations measure the performance of the IAM function within the organization. And this was the starting point of the research.
That's fantastic. So the research that you did, you kind of, again, what impressed me so much is I read a lot of the research that's done in our industry, but because you were writing an academic paper, the way it reads and the approach is just so similar to what I'm accustomed to in reading, academic and say almost like a medical journal, where you have all of the kind of the core data and how you used statistical analysis to reach your conclusions. One of the things that I noticed was kind of your collection method for data was computer-based surveys, right? So I guess you emailed out survey links to people and they responded to those. So how well were those received, and kind of how you went about designing those surveys, right? Because you have a lot of questions that you ask people. What went into how you designed those surveys?
Yeah, so ideally, when you start a survey, you would like to do a random sample from your target population. Here, my target population was obviously IAM professionals. But the problem is that there is no directory of all the IAM professionals in the world, nowhere. So you couldn't really run a random sample as we would do, for example, for medical research. That said, there are some modern techniques to do sampling of population via social networks. And I use LinkedIn as a way to do my sampling and to capture a population of IAM professionals. I sent, I don't remember, was it several hundreds questionnaires to the IAM professionals, asking them to contribute to the research. And I got approximately a little bit more than 300 answers, and a little bit more than 100, I would say, fully answered questionnaires with really meaningful data. And that was the threshold that I had to reach to be able to start to get some statistical analysis going from this data set.
Right.
I would like to mention something perhaps is that the data is not yet published, but my intention is that as accompanying the publication of the research report, hopefully in a few weeks from now, all the data will be made open sourced. The idea is that other researchers or IAM professionals may find it useful to reuse this data for complementary research. And I think that this would be interesting to have similar initiatives from other researchers. Like this, we could collect all these pieces of data on distinct areas and make it to benefit for the community.
Now, I kind of find, so one of my favorite researches that come out each year is the Verizon Data Breach Report, right? And so obviously a lot of design work goes into making it very flashy and look very attractive. But I mean, at the core of it, what's important is the data that kind of is in that report gets baked into that report. And the fact that, you can read it every year and the numbers change and there's trends that can be taken away. And when you compare where things were maybe a decade ago to where they are now, you really can glean some insight. And I'm kind of hopeful that with what you're working on, that you kind of take that approach that, this data gets refreshed maybe annually. I know that's a lot to ask from, at this point, I think you're a not-for-profit organization. But I think that this is the kind of, again, like you said, it's kind of a unique approach to look at people and process, which I don't think anybody else is really doing, right? Most of the focus is on technology and it's on data breaches and general or generic information security topics rather than specifically on identity and access management.
Yeah, it really is my intention to keep it going on in the coming years. Actually, there is a follow-up research project that I intend to start right away when this one will be finished. And it is to co-develop with field IAM practitioners a set of standardized performance metrics for IAM. So this will be the follow-up project once this one is completed.
So you were kind enough to share, some of the preliminary findings that you had, and I was kind of want to dive into a few of those. I think one of the things that came out, kind of right away was a question that you had around who handles IAM functions in organization, and whether it was centralized or distributed or maybe some sort of hybrid between the two. Can you share maybe some of what your thoughts were around what you discovered around that? And then was there any differences between maybe internal identity and access management versus external or like customer focused identity and access management?
Yeah, sure. So I had big surprises because, and this is the funny thing about research, is that all this, the thing you were absolutely certain about when you started, some of them just blow up during the research. So one thing that I had the intuition of, and that was confirmed by the research, was the population of IAM professionals. It is mainly composed of IT veterans with many years of experience in IT. Here, I think this is interesting because we know from the old Gartner report on, consider IAM as a process and not as a technology. We know that this process part is very important, and yet among IAM managers or key IAM actors, we mainly have people with IT backgrounds. So the profession may benefit from having managers that would come with complementary views perhaps from business schools or others. This would be something interesting. But this was not surprising because I have many colleagues in IAM, and they all have this IT background. Regarding the setup of the IAM function within the organization, the reporting lines of the IAM manager is one dimension that we looked into as part of the research. It was not surprising to see that half of the IAM managers directly report to the CISO, some to the CIO, a few to the COO, and so on and so forth. What was confirmed by the research is that the governance of IAM within the organization influences to an important degree the kind of priorities that are set for IAM and the kind of value proposition that the organization will obtain from the IAM function. So I think this is a rather it just confirms something obvious, I guess. If you report to the CIO or to the CISO or to both or to the COO, it will not be the same IAM, basically.
Yeah, and that makes sense. Do you find that teams are generally centralized to one area handling kind of all the IAM functions, or was it more, where there may be other teams kind of all handling identity and access management, but it really wasn't kind of their day job, right? Or their main focus, maybe a engineer or, someone in the business maybe who's just handling it because they have to. Did you find any any findings around that?
Yeah, absolutely. So on the centralization, decentralization dimension, I was very surprised. I had the intuition that if you would centralize the IAM function, and here I'm talking about IAM and all its subdomains, also PAM, customer IAM, and so on and so forth. If you would centralize it, I was convinced that you would reach higher maturity levels because you could pool resources and build something stronger. And that was completely wrong, this assumption. In fact, we see completely we don't see any statistical association between this centralization, decentralization dimension and the level of capability maturity reached by the IAM function. So this was counterintuitive. And I think this is very informative if you are considering how to set up your IAM function within your organization and you work in a large organization. Let's say that you have teams here and there with various scopes of responsibilities. Recentralizing everything may not yield any benefit to improve your processes. And this is highly counterintuitive, I think. It would require complementary research to dig more into what could be the reasons for these results. And this opens the door for later research.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting the way that you had structured the research itself. It was very methodical, very detailed, and you had, basically listed hypotheses that you had posited as far as IAM. And what I thought was interesting was, the designations of corroborated, partially corroborated, and then flat out rejected based on the research that you got, right? And I was very surprised around the hypothesis that centralization is positively associated with capability maturity, and that was not your findings. I mean, that definitely is counterintuitive, as you mentioned. I would think that with a centralized IAM team that you would have a much greater ability to standardize processes, procedures, and make sure that things like compliance are being kept at the same level. But it was interesting to read that your findings did not uncover that fact.
Yeah, absolutely. And here the sample is, the result is really statistically valid. And since I was so surprised by the result, I checked it, I think, 10 times, redoing the whole computation thing. And and there's just no other way to look at it than, that's how it is. But if centralization is not such, in fact, an important dimension, then specialization is. And here, what we see is that if those people managing the IAM functions, processes or sub-processes are specialized doing their task, here you will yield higher maturity levels. And so this suggests that if you invest in talent, if you invest in developing your IAM specialists and professionals, then it is worth it.
One thing I wanted to say, David, is, I think that this whole topic around centralization and maturity, it'll be hotly debated just because the statistics support the conclusion that there is not a correlation. Doesn't mean that people won't still kind of believe that. And this is one of the great things about academic research, right, is that it still leaves room for debate. But those of us who are, numbers people who prefer to take kind of that objective approach, it's going to make for some interesting conversation.
It is not because statistically it is true to state that there are no association between the two, that for all organizations in the world, every time it would be a wrong decision to centralize the IAM function. It really depends on every individual organization, obviously, and it may really make perfect sense for one particular organization to centralize IAM. And this may yield great benefits to the organization. This is really not what the study is saying. It doesn't say don't centralize the function. It just says in the observed sample data, which is representative of the profession, we don't see it any correlation between that and the IAM function succeeding.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So it's not that the research pointed to centralization being correlated to lower maturity. It was saying that centralization does not correlate to higher maturity. Now, there may be other drivers for centralization other than maturity. So that, yeah, I mean, I guess my going in position would have been what yours was, is that I would expect that with centralization, you have higher maturity. But probably what's happening is centralization is in most organizations is being driven around efficiency, doing more with fewer resources, things like that. So interesting, and probably it would be really interesting to get to, well, I think what people need to do is dive into the research a little bit more and kind of see what are the things that correlate with higher maturity, because that's important. The thing that I wanted to also bring up was kind of the questions you went into, which is where the IAM function reports. Because this is a question I often get. What is the best practice? Where should IAM report? Should it be to the CIO? Should it be to the CISO? Should it be higher up, lower down? Should it be a customer service function, or is it IT? And then the question I get is, what is best practice? And one of the things that I feel like that I wanted to point out, and I want to see if you agree with this, is that what most people are doing doesn't make it best practice. Best practice doesn't mean what do most people do. Best practice is the practice that is the most correct or the most effective. And so I wanted to see if kind of you look at best practice in the same way. If you were asked that question, how you would answer. So what is the best practice for where the IAM function should report?
Yeah, so I'd like to slice your questions in two pieces. There is the question of what a best practice is, and if we should use that expression, in fact. And the other question is to whom should the IAM function report? And part of the research was to collect what are the goals of IAM. And I've made from the literature review a list of all the possible goals for IAM. Well, not all the possible goals, but all the common goals for IAM. And it is a highly transversal function that can bring value in many areas in the organization. We all think of compliance and cybersecurity because these are the two key goals for IAM often. But in fact, IAM can yield value for the digital transformation of a company, to accelerate that transformation. It can bring productivity gains on a number of processes, and so on and so forth. And there are literally tens of possible goals for IAM. So how do you position IAM within the organization? I would say, what do you want to get from your IAM function? What are the priorities? For instance, if digital transformation, customer experience, and so on and so forth is key, well, I guess the digital transformation would be okay with the CIO. If customer experience is a fundamental thing, perhaps embedding IAM in the business units, or perhaps reporting to the CEO may be best. If you're completely focused on security and compliance things, then CISO may be a very well positioning. So first, get your strategy clearly define, know what you want to get from it, and then define your governance setup based on those priorities. And this may very well differ from one organization to the other. That answers the first question. So your best practice for IAM reporting line will depend on your strategy. And this may change in time, because today you may wish to use IAM for security purposes, for example. But then once that's set up and you feel that you reach a certain level of maturity, then you may wish to focus on customer experience. And so you may change or multiply the reporting lines of the IAM manager to sustain this new strategy. And then there is a question on what is the best practice. And ideally, I think we should not use that expression, because, the optimal practice for an organization is very much conditioned by the particular circumstances of that organization. So best practice is the mainstream consensus of how we should do things, but that may be very wrong for a single individual organization.
I agree. I think, something with best practice. So a lot of times I think best practice at a very micro level of should you disable an account or delete an account? Okay, that I feel like, while it's still not black and white, I still think that you can define a best practice around something like that. Where the IAM organization should report, or to whom it should report, I believe there's just so many different influential factors to that having one best practice is not realistic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I find it interesting that, I love the answer you just gave, right? It depends. Best practice depends, right? But it really is determined what you're trying to get out of it, right? And we see this, quite often where you have an internal IAM team, and they typically report to a CISO or somewhere in the security organization, and their motivations are driven by the CISO, security, compliance, right? If that IAM function reports to another area, like you mentioned, then the priorities, shift. And we see that a lot of times where maybe an e-commerce or a marketing team is responsible for customer IAM. They're more focused on the user experience, making it easy for the organization or for the customer to consume the organizational, resources or product or, whatever it may be. So I do think it does depend. And, for the folks who are listening, there isn't a right size answer other than what is the right thing for your organization, because as you mentioned, David, it does vary from organization to organization. One of the things that I thought was really interesting too around your research was the idea of IAM metrics and the reporting of them. And I think there are some that are, important and that are out there. Things like, how are things automated, provisioned, what's your compliance rate, et cetera. But one thing that sometimes gets lost in all this reporting is that the further away you get from the IAM function itself, the less understanding of IAM metrics there is. And I think that's something that's important for people to consider when they're building dashboards or, providing reporting to management. What are some of the things that you discovered around that?
You said it all. That's basically the thing. We have a number of populations to whom we would like to report IAM performance. These are completely distinct populations. We typically have top management, but we may have also business units to whom we may wish to report. We may report to security, to compliance, to a number of stakeholders. And obviously, one of the super key stakeholders here is top management, because they will fund IAM. So you'd better get your dashboard straight and make them meaningful for them. And probably because many IAM managers have an IT background, I guess that they tend to create dashboards that are cool with a lot of colors and things. does it get the idea straight to the point to top management that has a very short attention span to look at those dashboards and quickly see if basically the two questions they need to answer is, do I need to take a decision here? And what is that decision? And that's really the key thing. And are our dashboards currently helping management make decisions? If the answer is no, then our measurement is not fit for purpose.
Have metrics that tell the story and be able to defend it, I think, is important, right? And different people will find different metrics important.
When you do advisory services, for instance, I also worked in advisory services previously. When you do advisory services with a company, I'm sure then you have a sample of customers. Do you experience redoing these IAM dashboards based on requirements that have been expressed from top management? You've certainly done that exercise a few times.
Yeah, definitely. And I think a lot of it, the first question to come out of my mouth usually when we're doing that kind of work is, who's going to be looking at this, right? Because you don't want to fill up a whole bunch page of, a spreadsheet full of numbers isn't any good without any context behind it, and is sometimes too much detail. What is the decision that you're trying to get, whoever your decision maker is? So as we're looking at metrics and the way that things get reported, you want to make sure that it's targeted to your audience. And it's very similar for any type of, whether it's metrics or if you're trying to justify an IAM program, or even you're just trying to explain IAM in an elevator to somebody, right? You kind of have to know your audience and not bury the lead as far as what you're looking to communicate. If I'm in an elevator, or if I'm pitching, metrics towards someone on the technical side, I'll probably have more technical based metrics. If I'm posting more to the management side or even the executive level, I'm going to have very summary, detailed, executive speak level of detail when it comes to whatever it is I'm going to post out there. So it really does you have to tailor the message for whoever you're talking to. That is for sure.
Yeah, exactly. One weak point that we find among many IAM dashboards here is related to the theme of cost management. It seems that this is one of the areas where we have difficulties. I'm sure that advanced, total cost of ownership or ROI or these fancy things are perhaps a bit sophisticated. So I understand that this is not very common to see this in organizations, but just plain basic cost management, such as what is the cost of a single workforce identity for the organization? What is the cost of a customer identity for the organization? These questions, even if you don't have a sophisticated answer, providing some level of answer to these key questions to top management, I think it is extremely important.
Yeah, definitely. And you got to start somewhere, right? These are questions that you can ask as part of, trying to mature an organization. And a lot of times the answer is, wow, we really don't know, right? No one's ever really gone to the effort of counting up the number of paid licenses are associated with an account. What is the time it takes to provision that account? What is the time that it takes to manage the life cycle, password resets, right? And then you start getting into a lot more fuzzy areas like lost productivity and customer satisfaction, right? Things that's very difficult to measure. Or even just aversion of risk, right? What is, if it's properly managed versus improperly managed, trying to develop a way to measure against that is sometimes very difficult. And a lot of times organizations just haven't matured from a even just a data reporting and collection standpoint to be able to provide it accurately. But you've got to start somewhere. And I think at least, having something with that caveat and making sure people understand, how you're arriving at that number makes sense, to start throwing out there so that at least you can start to measure some of those things. That is for sure.
That's right. You start a conversation and you must be transparent about the limits of the exercise. about what you know and what you don't know. And yeah, then it is an opportunity to start a great conversation. For instance, also customer satisfaction is typically a dimension that is not being assessed very often. Even talking about internal customers for the IAM function, typically the workforce, what is the perceived experience with IAM? Is it something that they just don't understand and complain about and feel that it is impossible to manage, and it is something they feel they must fight against to get access to those things that they need to access to, customer satisfaction or internal customer satisfaction is something very basic to measure, and it may be very informative as to whether you are providing the level of service quality to your workforce that is expected by your workforce. And seeing it evolving from time to time, I think it is very important.
Yeah, I agree. And, my hat's off to you. This is such an excellent piece of research that you're able to come up with. And I think there's a lot of really interesting findings, and I'm looking forward to when it'll be available out there. So I think, that's probably a pretty good spot that we'll leave it for this week. I know, David, I know that when this research is available, I'm assuming you'll put something on LinkedIn or something along those lines so that people are aware of it and where they can find it. Will that be the case?
Yes, absolutely. I will publish the report as soon as it is finally approved through the full research process. And so that should come in a few weeks from now, I hope, perhaps a few months max. And I'll certainly post something on LinkedIn and on the Open Measure wiki. The report will be made publicly available, of course, for free, and it will be open sourced with all the accompanying data as soon as it will be published.
That is just awesome. And, I'll definitely be looking for it. And once we see it available, we'll definitely bring it up on the show. So we'll kind of remind people, whether it's a few weeks or whatever it is, that to make sure that, people take a look at it, because it really is an excellent body of work. So congratulations on that. Before we get things wrapped up here for the week, Jim, is there anything else that you'd like to bring up?
No, just a big thank you to David. I know he's a busy bee over there at the bank, and plus being a student and producing this fantastic work. So I really appreciate him taking the time to speak with us and our audience, and keep giving back, David. It is appreciated.
Thank you very much for having me on the show. I'm a super big fan of identity at the center. So thanks a lot for this opportunity to share.
Well, we appreciate your good taste in your podcast listening habits, that is for sure. So hopefully people out there enjoy it as well and are sharing amongst their friends. We've seen listenership continue to grow, even despite the pandemic, and kind of podcast listening habits be a little bit impact, especially the beginning, but, we continue to see growth, and, that helps us get, great topics and great guests like David on the show. So you can find out more about us at identityattthecenter.com. We've got, LinkedIn links for Jim and myself. We're always happy to connect with folks. If you've got ideas for shows, don't hesitate to send them in. We love to have topics that are of interest to the people, that we're talking with. And, you can always follow us on Twitter at IDAC Podcast. So with that, we're going to go ahead and close out for this week. Again, just another reminder about Ping Identity's Identify 2020 virtual conference. That's October 7th and 8th. We'll have a special episode for that. And hopefully you'll check that out. And we'll have links to all this information, including link to David on LinkedIn, the Open Measure website, the Identify 2020 conference, and more. So with that, we'll go ahead and close it out for this week. Appreciate it. Thanks for listening, and stay happy and healthy. You've been listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. For more episodes, visit identityattthecenter.com.